Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential Renaissance sacred works for beginners. Now, this is a very, very big topic, and picking out 10 works has been quite the project because there's just enormous quantities of this music. But you got to start somewhere, and this is actually a wonderful way to gather a lovely little selection of several centuries of music, which you may actually adore, or you should just have and sample at your leisure. There's no rush to get into it. But what do we mean by Renaissance sacred music? Well, the Renaissance historically was a very brief period. It was something, it was sort of the second half of the 15th century and then the beginning of the 16th. But then, there was the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation, and the Reformation, then the Counter-Reformation, and we get them in order. Historically, we're talking about very small chunks. And, the world of history is like the world of music. It keeps getting divided up into smaller pieces as scholarship breaks things up into increasing specializations in tinier and tinier areas of things. So technically, a lot of this music that we call Renaissance is much wider than that. It stems from the late medieval period, or the medieval period generally, up until the Baroque. And that's like from the 14th century all the way up until about 1600. I mean, that's a lot of time, a big chunk of time. And within that chunk of time, we're talking centuries, there are huge variations of style through the centuries because of time, and also regionally and the individual voices of the composers in question. And so you're going to hear all of that when you listen to this music. But because it's all written for unaccompanied choir, and it's all based on, some similar sacred texts, it is a little bit difficult to hear those variations up front. That's why I've made this list of 10 to give you a chance to sort of relax and triangulate and listen to the things that you like to listen to. But you should bear in mind that there is just as much variety in this music as there is in the difference between, say, Brahms and Wagner in the 19th century. There are big differences. So it's a very rich, wonderful repertoire. And the only thing you really need to know is that the Mass proper, that is the normal 5-part Catholic Mass in Latin, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus and Benedictus, and Agnus Dei and Dona Nobis Pacem. Those are the 5 big sections, right? Those sections, they are essentially the symphony of that period. Everybody wrote symphonies after Haydn sort of invented them, and those symphonies can take many different shapes and forms and sounds. Same thing with the Mass here. It was the blank slate on which composers operated, and the reason they did was because sacred music was virtually the only music of the day, aside from some songs and other things that got written down. It was the only music that was complex, that allowed composers to write in large forms, to use counterpoint, that is many voices all participating at once. And the unaccompanied choir was the orchestra in which the symphony of the day participated. And that's really all you need to know about it. And with that said, let's now go down the list. Now, in this particular list, which you can see below, I have indicated not just the composer, but the dates. And these dates are roughly chronological so that you can see where we're going. We're starting in about 1365, and we're ending in about 1611. So that gives you a sense of just what a huge amount of time we're talking about, in which people were doing basically the same forms, the same types of music. But yeah, I mean, it's quite a rich and huge repertoire. And because, there are so many fabulous small choral groups around, and it's not too expensive to record them, there are zillions of discs. I should talk about more of them on this channel than I do. Some of the works here I have discussed, and you can see separate videos about them. But for the most part, it's a specialized repertoire. It really is. It's one that I think everyone should sample, But, if you're not really into that sort of thing, it's not a big deal. The music is generally very, very tranquil, very beautiful, extremely relaxing, most of it. Some of it gets kind of tense and crazy, but by and large, since it was written for the liturgy and it had to work in the context of the liturgy, you're not going to hear the histrionics and hysteria of your typical, for example, Tchaikovsky or Mahler symphony in these choral works. But they are illustrative. The text of the Mass gave composers some wonderful opportunities to illustrate text. You have a crucifixion, you have a resurrection, you have Gloria in excelsis Deo, glory to God in the highest. You have Lamb of God, have mercy on us, give us peace. And the advantage to this particular style, this a cappella, meaning without instruments, choral style, is that the parts that are very texty, like in the middle of the credo where it says things that suggest nothing musically, I believe in one church and this and that and whatnot. You can simply set it to equally beautiful, flowing, polyphonic, meaning many-voiced music all the way through, and you get through it quite nicely without an obligation to do something. But if you want to do something, you can. So let's start. Guillaume de Machaut, the Messe de Nostre. This is before 1365. It is the earliest polyphonic, that is many-voiced setting of the complete Mass that has come down to us. And we know who wrote it. And that's really a fascinating thing. To get in at the beginning of something. It's kind of like Monteverdi's Orfeo from 1607-ish, or that period, 1611, somewhere in there. The first real opera that has come down to us. And it's a miracle that these things have survived and that we know what they are. The sound of this particular Mass is very raw, very primal. Harmonic theory, classical Western harmonic theory based on triads, that is major chords of 3 notes, had not yet evolved. And so this kind of singing has a really darkly stark feel to it, a raw, rough-edged sound to our ears. And it's a fascinating work to get to know. So after Machaut, we move, another, maybe almost 100 years, to Guillaume Dufay, his Missa L'homme armé. Now, this is what they call a parody Mass. And a parody Mass is a Mass that uses some pre-existing tune or work and absorbs it into the contrapuntal fabric of the work. And the tune L'homme armé was like the greatest hit of the 15th century. It goes, L'homme armé, da-da-dum. It's a very, very famous tune. And just about every composer wrote a Mass based on that tune. You will not hear the tune in the Mass because it's usually sung in very, very long notes in an inner part. And it just provides a sort of harmonic underpinning or substrate or foundation on which the composer could build his original work. So you don't have to worry about the fact that the tune is there. That's from about 1450. And Dufay was a major, major, major composer and a wonderful composer who wrote songs and masses. And that's what the people wrote in those days. It got written down. There was no instrumental music that has survived in a fleshed out form. There are just tunes, dance tunes, song tunes, and you arranged them. You worked with them however you wanted to work with them. You may have heard those like Renaissance or medieval instrumental ensembles where you've got like a shawm or a sackbut and a little percussion thing in there clanking along, playing these songs. That is all modern arrangements and reconstruction. There is very, very little original source material other than single lines of melody giving you the tune. All the rest is arrangement. So in the Masses, we get what the guy actually wrote, a fully fledged, fleshed out composition. And this is an absolutely magnificent sample of that and one of the most famous of these early Mass settings in existence. And like I said, you'll find dozens of L'homme armé Masses over the next 100 years or so. You could collect just those. I mean, it's really fun because you could get like 20 or 30 of them without any problem. Next, Ockeghem. Now, Ockeghem was one of the greatest representatives of the Franco-Flemish school, coming from Belgium, Netherlands, northern France, that part of the universe. He was an incredibly highly respected composer, an enormous contrapuntal genius, and he did the first setting of the Requiem Mass that has come down to us, the Mass for the Dead. Not the whole thing. I mean, it's a big, long, sort of imbroglio of text. If you like Verdi's Requiem, for example, it's like an hour and a half long. This is quite a bit more petite and concise, but it is a Requiem nonetheless. And it's a very, very beautiful setting. It's obviously, because it's a Mass for the Dead, more somber in tone than some of the more celebratory or general Mass settings, regular Mass settings. But he's a name that you should know. And that's the case with all of these pieces. I'm sort of giving you the names. And then once you have the names, you can go off on your own and explore them at greater leisure. Some of them have vast repertoires of stuff that have survived. Others, very, very little that has survived. But it's all great music, I guarantee you that. And you should really, really take your time going through it. And again, I caution my listeners who know this stuff. We are only talking about these 10 pieces. We will add nothing to the list, or I will simply delete the comment. This is enough. This is more than enough to give you a good foundation in this repertoire. Next, Josquin. Josquin des or Desprez, or however they pronounced it back in the day. He was a genius. And there's lots of stuff. There's masses, and there's motets, which are, short sacred works in a single movement, which are similar in texture and tone to the masses. These masses can be written for anywhere from 3, 4, 5, 6 voices, sometimes a lot of voices, but they're generally between 4 and 6 parts, or voices, as they call them. Those voices can be either done one person to a part or several people on each part. Sometimes they even have instruments which can take one of the vocal parts. There were very few hard and fast rules regarding performance in those days. And a lot of what we do with respect to performance is somewhat conjectural, because what we have is the notes. We don't have expressive markings. We don't have tempo markings. You have to add all of that yourself based on the flow of the music and the sense of the text, because the actual manuscripts are just the words and the notes, and that's about it. Anyway, Josquin's Missa Ave Maris Stella is just one of the most beautiful works of its type. It is simply, I keep saying these things are gorgeous. They are gorgeous. There's a luminous, transcendental quality to the music, to the flow of the music. And Josquin was his music is fabulously beautiful. He also did L'homme armé twice, 2 masses based on that tune. But the Missa Ave Maris Stella, I think, is one of his very greatest. It's one of his most popular. There are many fine performances of it, and you will enjoy it, I have no doubt. Next, I did do a big video, by the way, Dave's Handy Guide to Renaissance Polyphony. I suggest you watch that video, because it goes into this stuff in more detail with musical examples that allows you to sort of get your foundation and focus. So there's that too, by the way. I have to mention that. Next, John Taverner. Now, John Taverner is the English composer, Taverner with an as opposed to Taverner without the who is the modern British composer who is simply awful. You want to probably avoid. Anyway, John Taverner was one of the great composers of the early British school. His Missa Gloria tibi Trinitas comes from about 1520, so we're moving up in the world. Josquin was about 1490. We were at 1460 with Ockeghem, 1450 with Dufay. So we're up to about 1520 now. Now, the British school had its own sound, and that sound was characterized by very high treble parts, or they were soprano parts, but they would have been sung by boys, not women. So they were called trebles. And it's an extremely beautiful and ethereal sound, one that's completely unique. It's part of the British school. There were several other composers who we listened to, Fairfax and Shepherd and people like that, Christopher Tye, who were similarly writing in that style. And it's unique. It's absolutely unique. And Taverner is a wonderful composer to get to know when you're listening to these other things, to get a sense of the stylistic differences between the major schools of composition in this general multi-century period. So after Taverner, one of the great continental composers, Orlando de Lassus, or Roland de Lassus, or you may hear him called various things. We used to call him Orlando de Lassus or Orlando Lassus. Now he's called Roland de Lasso. It depends whether you do it in French or Italian or whatever it was. But he was one of those Franco-Flemish guys, essentially. A lot of them spent time in Italy, too. It's amazing how peripatetic these people were. They got around. They really did. Most of them managed to get to Italy to do some training, and then they came back and they were attached either to the major cathedrals or to a court, an aristocratic court where they were the official composers. Lassus wrote a lot of music and fabulously detailed, expressive music. And so for his, I have an early piece of Lassus here, his Prophetiae Sibyllarum, the Sibylline prophecies from around 1555. This is thought to be an early work. It is a mannered work. Mannerism means the same thing as sort of Sturm und Drang in the classical period. Very expressive, dissonant harmonies, an overtly emotional means of communication. And these works are really gripping and strange because they are Sibylline prophecies. In this case, the prophecies are of Jesus and, the Christian prophecies. They're not like, the squid with 75 feet and, that kind of thing. But they are amazingly expressive and beautiful works. And fortunately, they've been recorded multiple times. This is one of those discs you just got to have. It's got to be in your collection. You are going to love it. You may not play it every day. I don't. I wouldn't. It's a special occasion kind of thing, but it's extraordinary. So after Lassus, we come to Palestrina. Now, Palestrina is sort of regarded as the father of this whole era, which is remarkable because his music is in some ways the most innocuous and least obviously interesting of all of them. And by that, what I mean is Palestrina, came down in history as, first of all, the ultimate master of early polyphony from a technical point of view. Beautifully shaped, exquisitely patterned, and rather similar sounding. He wrote like 100 masses or more. There's tons and tons of stuff. And he wrote the Pope Marcellus Mass around 1562, the Mass which supposedly saved music because the church fathers were thinking of banning polyphony from the church service in favor of plain, straight Gregorian chant, single line of melody with no adornments, embellishments, or complications. And it was Palestrina who showed that music could be dull enough that it deserved to survive. That's a fairly crude way of putting it, granted, but his music does have this cool beauty. It's a lot like the similar paintings of Botticelli, beautiful pastels, very, very carefully etched forms, and a general coolness to it, a lack of emotional intensity. And that's the style, that's Palestrina's style. And he was incredibly famous and highly regarded. His masses were used essentially as training textbooks for generations of composers that came after them because his writing in various parts was so perfectly done and and established essentially the rules. And that may be very boring for you to hear. I mean, it's sort of strange that his music is as popular as it is in the sense that, everybody takes out the Pope Marcellus Mass as representative of the period, when in fact there's tons of other music which is vastly more immediately expressive. But there's a place for that kind of classical beauty, the proportion, the elegance, and you hear it. Again, it's a style. It's like Stravinsky's neoclassical music, that cool, unemotional, very, very beautiful, but somewhat distant, emotionally disengaged music. And that's what Palestrina did. And you can sample it at your leisure. Now, after Palestrina, we're going back to England, to Thomas Tallis. Now, Tallis had a compatriot who I also mentioned here, William Byrd. They were two of the very greatest composers of the age. Tallis wrote a great deal of music, but he's best known for his 40-part motet, Spem in Alium, which is the subject of a separate video. Spem in Alium is, I'm not translating the Latin here, I mean, it doesn't matter, you can look it up if you care. It's all religious, it's all, that sort of thing. But the point about Spem in Alium is that it's written for 8 5-part choirs. It is one of the largest pieces of music by anybody of any period. It's only about 12 minutes long. And it's sort of become an iconic representative work of its period and of this style that is not Palestrina. This is a big, jumbo, economy-size kind of work. And it shows you really just what the scale is in this period, because there are many, many large works for 16 parts or 20 parts or huge pieces for competing choirs of voices, masses of sound that composers could manipulate. And that's a whole sort of subset of works from this period that you can explore if you enjoy it. William Byrd was a recusant Catholic. He was a Catholic after the Anglican Reformation, the schism that brought about by Henry VIII. And as a result of that, there were Catholics and there were Anglicans and they were fighting and they had civil wars, and that always creates good music. Struggle and tension and hysteria, you always get really good artistic products when that happens, and this is no exception. Now, Byrd wrote 3 masses, and I've listed them all for 3, 4, and 5 voices. They're very interesting to hear for that reason, because you can hear the range of what you might call orchestration, vocal orchestration in these pieces. They are generally short. They're about 20 minutes long each. They were written for private performance in secret, because Catholic worship was banned at this point in England. We're talking about 1593-ish. We all know who was around then. We're talking Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I and all of those people. Tallis was about 1570, Palestrina 1562. In that area, we don't really have precise dates for most of these pieces. We have general dates. But so these masses, which were written to be performed in private chapels, out of the public eye, are intimate and extraordinarily beautiful, and you get to hear the different range of contrapuntal combinations using different numbers of voices in a very clear, simple way. Usually you get all 3 of them on one disc. It's a handy way to get them, and so that's worth considering. Byrd wrote music for both services. He wrote music in English, by the way. He wrote something called the Great Service, which is a Latin Mass, essentially translated into English for the Anglican Rite, and he also wrote these pieces for the Catholic Church. And last but not least, we're going crazy with Carlo Gesualdo. Gesualdo was famous for having murdered his wife and her lover, and having to spend the rest of his life hiding from his wife's lover's family because they were out to kill him. And so he spent his life locked up in this castle. He was crazy. He was absolutely out of his mind. He was supposedly into sort of flagellation and sadomasochistic, doodads like that. His music is extremely, extremely revolutionary in its harmonic implications, and also in its emotional darkness and anguish. And that's where we're going to end. Darkness and anguish. Isn't that fun? It just goes to show you that that's what this music could do. But Gesualdo came very late to this type of music. We're talking about his Tenebrae Responsoria around 1611. These were the pieces written for Holy Week leading up to Easter, and they are dark. They are dark and spooky. Just to show you that they could do dark and spooky. Very, very beautiful. He wrote basically this stuff and a pile of madrigals, which are also dark and spooky. I mean, some of them aren't. Some of them are happy and jolly and whatnot, but harmonically very free, extremely text-based. If the music said anguish, it's anguished. If it says dark, it's dark. If it goes up, it goes up. If it goes down, it goes down. If the words suggest that kind of behavior. It's programmatic music. It's music very, very illustrative of its text and harmonically very free. And it comes at the very end of this period that we're talking about, because simultaneously with Gesualdo, you had Monteverdi and his crew who were initiating the Baroque period, the second practice, the school of melody with continuo accompaniment. And for the next 150 years or so, from 1600 to 1750, the death of Bach and those people, and Handel, that's what they'd be working with. But this is the end. And Gesualdo makes a very fitting ending to that period and to this discussion. So I really hope that this little introduction will point you in the right direction and give you a sense of what's out there, and you can explore at your leisure. But like I said, take your time, see if you like it, listen to some stuff on YouTube, and don't rush it. Make it a special moment in your musical listening. And I think the music will strike you for its range, its color, its beauty, its affecting emotional range as well, and all of those qualities. It's a new language, and like learning a new language, you need to absorb it at your leisure, and keep on listening. Friends, thank you so much for joining me. Take care.